southeastern Minnesota, October 3, 1867. While the rest of the prairie homesteaders raced to raise their cabins on high ground before the first hard snow, Ingrid Halvorsen climbed down into a limestone sinkhole on her claim, 12 feet below the wind, and began laying her foundation where every sensible settler said a home would become a freezer. Wagons creaked past on the ridge. Axes rang in the timberline. Men shouted measurements and warnings. But Ingrid didn't argue. She leveled the bottom of that 30-foot bowl with tamped earth and limestone gravel, as calm as if she were setting a hearthstone. Then she started notching logs down in the pit, building low on purpose, building where the wind couldn't bite. From the hilltops, her neighbors watched the widow disappear into the ground day after day, and they laughed, because everyone knew the same rule out here: cold sinks. In an unheated, undrained pit, the neighbors would have been right. Cold and water can collect there fast, and people have died that way. Her neighbors, the Johnsons, the O'Malleys, the Schmidt family, watched with growing concern as Ingrid began hauling her modest collection of possessions down into that sinkhole. "She's lost her mind with grief," Martha Schmidt whispered to her husband as they drove their wagon past Ingrid's claim. "Building in a hole like that? The cold air will settle there and freeze her solid. Everyone knows cold sinks." The men at the township's only general store were less kind in their assessments. "That Norwegian widow is digging her own grave," said Patrick O'Malley, shaking his head. "Come February, they'll find her frozen like a statue down in that pit." Thomas Johnson, who had built a fine 2-story log cabin on the highest point of his land to catch the summer breezes, rode over one afternoon in late September to offer Ingrid his advice. "Mrs. Halvorsen," he said with the patient tone one uses with the confused, "that sinkhole will be a cold trap. The freezing air will pour in there like water into a bucket. You'll never be able to heat it properly. Please, let me help you select a better building site on the ridge." Ingrid thanked him politely in her accented English, her weathered hands never stopping their work of notching logs. "Mr. Johnson, I appreciate your concern, but I know what I am doing." What none of them understood, what they couldn't possibly grasp from their limited experience with the brutal Minnesota winters, was that Ingrid had grown up in the Gudbrandsdalen Valley of Norway, where her family's farm sat in a deep mountain valley that seemed to defy the logic of the harsh Scandinavian winter. She had memories that her neighbors lacked, observations that her late husband had dismissed but that she had stored away like seeds waiting for the right soil. She remembered how the deepest valleys stayed strangely comfortable while the mountain farms suffered exposure to screaming winds. She remembered her grandmother's stories of ancient dugouts and why the old ones always built low when they built for winter. But none of this would matter if she couldn't convince them or survive to prove her point. As October arrived with its first frost, Ingrid's cabin began to take shape in the bottom of that sinkhole, and the neighboring women started organizing what they called a mercy committee to take her in when the inevitable happened. They would shake their heads as they passed, watching her work from dawn until dusk, her aging frame hauling logs and mixing clay, disappearing into that earthen bowl day after day. But first, everyone laughed. The structure Ingrid built was unlike anything the Minnesota homesteaders had seen. She started by leveling the sinkhole floor with meticulous care, creating a perfectly flat foundation of tamped earth mixed with limestone gravel that naturally occurred in the sinkhole itself. Then, instead of building a conventional single-wall log cabin, she constructed something that looked almost like 2 cabins, one inside the other. The outer wall was made of rough-hewn tamarack logs, the most rot-resistant which she could find in the scattered groves along the creek bottoms, stacked horizontally in traditional Scandinavian fashion with carefully fitted saddle notches at the corners. But here's where her design diverged from everything her neighbors knew. The outer wall didn't rise much above the rim of the sinkhole itself. She stopped at just 7 feet in height, creating what appeared to be a squat, half-buried structure. The inner wall, built from better quality oak logs she had traded 2 months of butter and cheese to acquire, sat exactly 18 inches away from the outer wall, creating an air gap that ran completely around the cabin's perimeter. The neighbors who occasionally stopped to watch couldn't understand the purpose. "Why waste good oak on a second wall?" asked young Henrik Schmidt, who had helped her roll several of the heavier logs into position. "And why leave that gap? It makes no sense." What neighbors didn't realize was that Ingrid was creating something her family in Norway had called a setter's stew, a shieling cabin, but adapted for the specific conditions of Minnesota. The 18-inch gap between walls would serve a purpose that wouldn't become apparent until the temperature plummeted. She packed the bottom 6 inches of this gap with loose prairie grass that she had been cutting and drying all summer, creating a cushion that would serve as both insulation and moisture barrier. But she left the upper portion of the gap completely empty, just dead air space running between the 2 log walls. The roof design puzzled everyone even more. Instead of the conventional steep-pitched roof designed to shed snow, Ingrid built a nearly flat roof with only a slight pitch, using layers of split logs covered with birch bark, then a thick layer of prairie sod. "That roof will collapse under the first heavy snow," predicted William O'Malley with absolute certainty. "And even if it doesn't, the water will leak through and rot everything." But Ingrid had calculated the load-bearing capacity carefully, using shorter, stouter rafters spaced more closely than conventional construction. She had seen sod roofs in Norway lasting 50 years or more. The real secret would only become clear later, but Ingrid had designed her cabin to work with the earth rather than against it. The sinkhole itself provided something invaluable: protection from wind. While the other homesteads sat exposed on the prairie ridges, catching every howling blast that screamed down from the Canadian territories, her cabin would sit cradled in the earth itself. The limestone walls of the sinkhole, though irregular and sloping, would act as a barrier against the wind's relentless assault. But there was a problem she hadn't anticipated. In mid-October, 3 weeks into construction, an autumn storm brought 3 days of cold rain. Water began pooling in the bottom of the sinkhole, and for the first time, doubt crept into Ingrid's weathered face. The neighbors who saw the water collecting had their suspicions confirmed. "That's it," said Martha Schmidt. "She'll be flooded out before winter even arrives." The poor woman simply didn't think it through. Ingrid worked frantically during a brief break in the rain, digging a drainage channel along the base of the sinkhole's eastern wall, where the limestone was most fractured. She angled it carefully, using techniques her husband had once employed for draining their field back in Norway. The channel led to a natural seam in the limestone that seemed to swallow the water into the bedrock below. It was either geological luck or Ingrid's keen eye for landscape reading, but within hours, the standing water had vanished, percolating down into the porous limestone layers beneath. The crisis had passed, but few neighbors had witnessed the solution. They only remembered seeing the flooded cabin site. By early November, with the first snow flurries dusting the prairie, Ingrid completed her unusual home. The interior measured just 16 feet by 20 feet, modest even by frontier standards, but she had made every inch count. A central fireplace built from the sinkhole's own limestone sat against the north wall, with a chimney that rose only 4 feet above the roof level, far shorter than the tall chimneys her neighbors built. "That chimney won't draw," observed Thomas Johnson, who stopped by one cold morning to deliver a basket of potatoes as a gesture of charity. "The smoke will pour back into the cabin." What they didn't understand was the relationship between chimney height, draft, and wind exposure. Little did they know that Ingrid's low chimney, protected by the sinkhole's rim from crosswinds, would draw more consistently than their tall chimneys being battered by prairie gales. But she simply thanked Thomas for the potatoes and invited him to visit in February if he wanted to see how her mistake performed. He laughed, not unkindly, but with the certainty of a man who knew he was right, and rode back up to his hilltop cabin. As November progressed into December, smoke began rising daily from Ingrid's stumpy chimney. The snow fell in earnest now, covering the prairie in a thick white blanket. What fascinated the few neighbors who passed near her claim was that the snow around her sinkhole behaved differently than anywhere else. While the hilltop cabins stood surrounded by drifts that grew taller with each storm, the snow around Ingrid's sunken cabin seemed to settle more evenly, without the massive drifts that plagued conventional homesteads. The sinkhole's rim acted as a natural windbreak, preventing the scouring winds from creating those towering drifts that could trap families inside for days. But the real test hadn't arrived yet. December in Minnesota was merely a preview. Everyone knew that January and February would bring the true killing cold, temperatures that could drop to 30 below zero or worse, with wind chills that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The neighbors had stopped laughing by now. Their amusement had turned to grim anticipation. They expected to find Ingrid frozen or desperately burning her furniture for warmth by month's end. Several families made plans to take her in when she finally admitted defeat. Meanwhile, inside her sunken cabin, Ingrid continued her daily routines with a calmness that would have shocked her observers. She had laid in 4 cords of mixed hardwood, oak, ash, and ironwood, which the men at the store had assured her wouldn't be nearly enough for a Minnesota winter. A conventional cabin her size would burn through 8 to 10 cords easily. But Ingrid knew something they didn't. Something about heat and earth and the ancient wisdom of building low and building protected. The genius of Ingrid's design lay in understanding principles of thermodynamics that most frontier settlers grasped only intuitively, if at all. What she had created was essentially a multi-layered thermal management system that worked with natural physics rather than fighting against it. To understand why her cabin would succeed while her neighbors struggled, we need to examine what was actually happening in the cold Minnesota winter air. Heat moves in 3 fundamental ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. A conventional frontier cabin sitting exposed on a hilltop faced the full assault of all 3 working against it. Conduction pulled heat through the log walls directly into the frigid exterior air. Convection currents, driven by howling prairie winds, constantly stripped warmth from the outer wall surfaces and carried it away. Radiation allowed heat to escape into the cold night sky. The homesteaders understood they were losing heat, certainly, but they had no framework for understanding the mechanisms or how to counter them effectively. Ingrid's double-wall design addressed conduction in a remarkably sophisticated way. That 18-inch air gap between the inner oak wall and the outer tamarack wall created what modern engineers would call a thermal break. Air, particularly still air, is actually an excellent insulator, better than wood itself. The outer tamarack wall would grow cold, certainly, perhaps dropping to near ambient temperature on a bitter night. But that cold had to cross 18 inches of trapped, relatively still air before reaching the inner oak wall. The packed prairie grass at the bottom of the gap prevented convection currents from forming in that air space, keeping the air relatively motionless and maximizing its insulating value. Historical records from Scandinavian building traditions, documented in homesteader journals from Wisconsin and Minnesota, show that double-wall construction with air gaps could effectively double the thermal resistance of a structure. A single 8-inch log wall might have an R value equivalent of about 8 to 10. Adding a second wall with an air gap could push the effective R value to between 16 and 20, comparable to a well-insulated modern structure. Ingrid didn't know these numbers, but she knew from experience that her grandmother's double-walled setterstu in Norway stayed comfortable while single-walled structures suffered. The sinkhole itself provided the second critical element: wind protection. Wind is the enemy of heat retention. Even a modest breeze of 10 miles per hour can increase heat loss from an exposed surface by 50% or more through forced convection. The prairie winds that screamed across Minnesota in winter regularly exceeded 20 to 30 miles per hour, with gusts much higher. Thomas Johnson's hilltop cabin, perched to catch summer breezes, faced the full brunt of these winds. Every surface of his cabin was continuously scoured by frigid air, stripping away warmth as fast as his fireplace could generate it. Ingrid's cabin, nestled 12 feet below grade, lived in a different world. The sinkhole's rim broke up wind patterns, creating a relatively calm pocket of air. Wind speeds at the cabin's outer wall would be reduced to perhaps 20% of what raged above. This meant that the convective heat loss from her outer wall was dramatically reduced. The air in the gap between walls stayed calmer still. It was a fortress against the wind's assault, built not with thickness but with clever positioning. The third element was earth coupling, though Ingrid wouldn't have used that term. Soil, once you get below the frost line, maintains a relatively stable temperature year-round. In Minnesota, the frost line extends down about 4 feet. Below that depth, the earth remains at a temperature close to the annual average, roughly 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit in southeastern Minnesota. This is far warmer than January surface temperatures, but cooler than summer heat. By building partially below grade, with her cabin floor just 12 feet down, Ingrid had placed her living space in close proximity to this stable thermal mass. The earth surrounding the sinkhole wouldn't directly heat her cabin, but it would prevent the extreme temperature swings that plagued surface structures. The limestone walls of the sinkhole, once they cooled below the frost line's depth, would stabilize at that moderate temperature, never freezing hard like surface rock, never warming to summer heat. This thermal stability meant less energy needed to maintain comfort. The science behind this was surprisingly simple, though frontier settlers rarely articulated it clearly. Earth is a massive heat sink and heat source simultaneously. It responds slowly to temperature changes because of its thermal mass. A cubic yard of limestone has roughly 500 times the thermal mass of a cubic yard of air. Once warmed or cooled, it stays at that temperature for extended periods, moderating the environment around it. Indigenous peoples across the northern plains had understood this instinctively, building earth lodges and pit houses that used this principle. Scandinavian settlers had similar traditions with their sunken storehouses and cellars. Ingrid was applying ancient wisdom to her homestead cabin. Meanwhile, as winter approached, her neighbors faced different physics. The Johnsons' cabin, built with excellent craftsmanship from quality logs, nevertheless sat exposed on all sides. The floor, raised slightly above ground on limestone piers to prevent rot, had a crawl space beneath where cold air circulated freely. The ceiling, just rough-sawn boards below an attic space, allowed warm air to rise and pool uselessly above the living space. Heat stratification meant that while the air near the ceiling might reach 70 degrees, the floor stayed cold enough to chill feet through boot leather. Ingrid's low ceiling, just 7 feet at its peak, prevented this stratification. Warm air had nowhere to escape. The sod roof above provided additional insulation, with the snow that accumulated on it adding yet another insulating layer. Snow, being mostly trapped air between ice crystals, is an excellent insulator. One reason igloos work. A foot of snow on a roof can add R values of 5 to 8. Ingrid's sod roof, typically buried under 2 to 3 feet of Minnesota snow by midwinter, gained considerable insulation from what her neighbors saw as a burden to be shoveled off their roofs. Historical records show that similar earth-sheltered structures built by Scandinavian immigrants in the Dakotas and Minnesota maintained interior temperatures 30 to 40 degrees warmer than exterior temperatures, while using 50 to 60% less firewood than conventional cabins. A Norwegian immigrant named Johannes Nordbo, who homesteaded in Dakota Territory in 1869, wrote in a letter preserved in the Minnesota Historical Society, "My brother built his house on the hill, and I built mine in the low ground, set into the earth. He burns 6 cords of wood each winter, and still they freeze. I burn 3 cords and sit comfortably in my shirt sleeves." The fireplace design also mattered more than most realized. Ingrid had built a classic Scandinavian masonry heater, what Norwegians called a peisoven, rather than a simple open fireplace. The firebox was relatively small, but the smoke path ran through several chambers within the limestone mass before exiting the chimney. This meant the hot exhaust gases gave up their heat to the stone mass instead of escaping wastefully up the chimney. The limestone would heat slowly during the day's fire, then radiate warmth for hours after the fire died down. A conventional fireplace like the Johnsons might be only 15 to 20% efficient. For every cord of wood burned, 80% of the heat went straight up the chimney. Ingrid's masonry heater approached 60 to 70% efficiency, capturing and storing heat in the stone mass. Combined with her reduced heat loss through superior insulation and wind protection, she could stay comfortable on a fraction of the firewood her neighbors required. The low chimney that Thomas Johnson had criticized actually worked in her favor. Protected from crosswinds by the sinkhole's rim, it drew steadily and consistently. The Johnsons' tall chimney, exposed to full prairie winds, created variable draft, sometimes drawing too hard and pulling excessive heat from the cabin, other times creating downdrafts that pushed smoke back inside when wind patterns shifted. Ingrid's chimney, humble and short as it was, maintained steady pressure and consistent performance. There was another factor at play that none of the settlers quite grasped. The sinkhole created a microclimate. Cold air does indeed sink. The neighbors were right about that physical principle. But in a sinkhole with a heat source at the bottom, the physics became more complex. The warmth radiating from Ingrid's cabin, escaping through her chimney and through the sod roof, would rise and pool at the rim level. This created a temperature gradient where the coldest air sat not at the bottom with her cabin, but actually at the rim level, before spilling over onto the surrounding prairie. The sinkhole acted like a thermal cup, holding a layer of relatively warmer air around the cabin while the coldest air flowed over and away. German settlers in Wisconsin had similar observations about building in protected hollows. A homesteader named Klaus Richter, who built his home in a ravine, noted in 1871, "The thermometer at the store in town reads 20 below, but here in our hollow it is never worse than 5 below. The wind cannot reach us, and our walls stay dry where others frost over." Moisture management was yet another subtle advantage. The Johnsons' cabin, exposed to driving winds and temperature swings, experienced freeze-thaw cycles on their walls. Moisture from breathing, cooking, and daily living would migrate into the log walls, freeze solid during cold snaps, then partially thaw when temperatures moderated or sun struck the walls. This cycling damaged wood structure over time and created interior frost in cold weather. Ingrid's double wall design allowed moisture to escape into the outer wall while keeping the inner wall warmer and drier. The outer wall could freeze solid without affecting comfort inside. As December deepened, these principles began to show their effects, though subtly at first. Neighbors who had to split frozen wood in the 30 below cold wondered why they saw Ingrid outside working comfortably at 10 above, not realizing that the sinkhole was 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the exposed prairie. Families that burned through a quarter cord of wood every 3 days watched in puzzlement as Ingrid's modest woodpile seemed barely diminished week after week. But the real vindication would come later. The true test came in January of 1868. The winter of 1868 carved itself into Minnesota history as one of the most brutal on record. January arrived with temperatures that seemed to mock human habitation. On January 9th, the thermometer at Fort Snelling recorded 42 degrees below zero, and that was in the relatively protected river valley. Out on the open prairie where the homesteaders lived, temperatures plunged even further. The wind never stopped, howling week after week from the northwest, driving walls of snow before it and creating wide-out conditions that could last for days. Thomas Johnson's beautiful two-story cabin became a prison of cold. Despite burning wood at a prodigious rate, nearly a full cord every 4 days, the interior temperature hovered between 35 and 45 degrees. Frost formed on the interior walls, particularly near the floor and around the windows. The family slept together in the main room, abandoning the upstairs entirely as heat rose uselessly into that space. Martha Schmidt's children developed chilblains on their fingers and toes despite never going outside. The O'Malley's water bucket froze solid 6 feet from their fireplace. The wind was relentless. It found every gap between logs, every imperfect chinking joint, and exploited it mercilessly. The cabins groaned and creaked under the assault. The tall chimneys that had seemed so practical and proper in summer became a liability. Wind rushing across their tops created variable pressure that made fires burn erratically, sometimes pulling so hard the fireplace roared like a forge, other times creating downdrafts that filled rooms with smoke. Desperation drove innovation. The Johnsons hung blankets and quilts across their windows, sacrificing light for any reduction in cold. They stuffed additional chinking into gaps with frozen fingers. William O'Malley built a second, smaller fireplace in his cabin, thinking 2 heat sources would solve his problem, only to discover he now needed even more firewood to feed both. By mid-January, several families had burned through half their winter wood supply, with 3 more months of winter ahead. Panic crept into conversations at the store when anyone could make it there through the storms. Meanwhile, in the bottom of that ridiculous sinkhole everyone had mocked, Ingrid Halvorsen sat comfortably at her small table, writing a letter to her sons by lamplight, wearing only a wool dress and shawl. The interior temperature of her sunken cabin, measured by a simple mercury thermometer she had brought from Norway, read 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the temperature had fallen to 19 degrees below zero. The difference was 77 degrees. Her daily routine seemed almost mundane. Each morning, she would build a modest fire in her masonry heater, using perhaps a quarter of the wood her neighbors burned. The fire would burn hot for 2 to 3 hours, heating the limestone mass. Then she would let it die down to coals, banking them with ash. The stone would radiate gentle heat for the rest of the day and well into the night. Around evening, she would add enough wood to revive the fire for another hour or two, heating the stone mass again for nighttime. Some of the coldest nights required a third, middle-of-the-night fire, but this was rare. The double wall construction performed exactly as she had envisioned. The outer tamarack wall bore the brunt of the cold, frost forming thick on its interior surface within the air gap. But that 18 inches of trapped air now completely motionless in the deep cold, acted as a profound barrier. The inner oak wall remained comfortable to the touch, just slightly cool, but never frost-covered, never bitter. The gap between walls had essentially created dead air space that insulated better than a foot of solid wood could have. The sinkhole's protection became dramatically apparent during the worst storms. When wind speeds on the prairie reached 40 miles per hour, creating ground blizzards that reduced visibility to zero and wind chills approaching 80 below, Ingrid experienced only gentle air movement at the bottom of her sinkhole. Snow filled in around the rim, creating an almost complete bowl that sheltered her further. The snow itself, accumulating to 4 and 5 feet on the prairie, never drifted deeply in the sinkhole. Instead, it formed a relatively even blanket that added insulation to the already protected space. The snow on her sod roof, which neighbors had predicted would collapse the structure, instead created a thick insulating blanket that pushed the effective insulation value of her ceiling to extraordinary levels. With 3 feet of snow sitting atop 2 feet of sod over her split-log roof deck, heat loss through the ceiling became negligible. The snow's presence also moderated the roof's temperature, preventing the freeze-thaw cycles that plague shake roofs on neighboring cabins. It was Henrik Schmidt, the young man who had helped roll logs months earlier, who first discovered the truth. On January 23rd, during a brief break in the weather, he decided to check on the widow he had been worrying about. He struggled through chest-deep drifts to reach her claim, expecting to find disaster. Instead, he found Ingrid outside her cabin in the sheltered sinkhole, wearing just a heavy coat, chopping vegetables on a stump without gloves. The temperature in the sinkhole felt almost spring-like compared to the prairie above, probably 20 degrees warmer, though he had no instrument to measure. "Mrs. Halvorsen?" Henrik called down, his voice full of confusion. Are you all right?" Ingrid looked up and smiled. "Of course, Henrik. Would you like some coffee?" Come down. It's warmer here." Henrik descended into the sinkhole and immediately felt the difference. Out of the wind, the space felt remarkably comfortable. When Ingrid opened her cabin door to invite him inside, a wave of genuinely warm air washed over him, a sensation he hadn't experienced in weeks in his own home. Inside, he stood in wonderment. No frost on the walls, comfortable warmth radiating from the limestone fireplace. Ingrid's small collection of plants on the windowsill actually looked healthy, not frozen dead like every plant in his mother's cabin. How was all he could manage. Ingrid poured him coffee and explained her design patiently. She showed him the double wall construction, explained about the air gap and trapped air insulation. She demonstrated how her masonry heater stored heat in stone. She walked him around the sinkhole's rim, pointing out how the wind roared overhead but barely disturbed them below. Henrik listened with the intensity of a man learning that everything he thought he knew was wrong. "How much wood are you burning?" he asked, thinking of his family's dwindling supply. "Perhaps half a cord since December 1st, Ingrid replied. "I have more than enough to last until April." Half a cord in 6 weeks. Henrik's family had burned nearly 3 cords in the same period and still shivered constantly. The difference was undeniable. Henrik raced back to spread the word. Within 3 days, despite the ongoing cold snap, every family within 5 miles had sent someone to visit Ingrid's cabin. Thomas Johnson came, his earlier certainty shattered. He stood in her warm cabin, examining the construction with a builder's eye, understanding for the first time what she had created. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Completely wrong. This is genius." William O'Malley measured the temperature inside and outside, calculating the difference over and over as if the numbers might change. 73 degrees difference, he kept repeating. 73 degrees. His tall hilltop cabin, with its massive chimney, maintained barely 30 degrees of difference. Martha Schmidt brought Ingrid a basket of precious dried apples and preserves. Not charity anymore, but respect and gratitude. "Will you teach us?" she asked. "Can this be built elsewhere, or does it require a sinkhole?" Ingrid considered this. The sinkhole helps very much with wind protection. But the double walls and earth sheltering, these can be done other ways. Build into a hillside. Build with earth berms around the walls. Protect from wind first, then insulate with air gaps and mass. The pioneers in my valley in Norway did this many ways. As word spread across the township, Ingrid's cabin became something of a winter pilgrimage site. Homesteaders would brave the cold to see the proof with their own eyes. Some took measurements. Others sketched diagrams. A few simply sat in her warm cabin for an hour, experiencing comfort they hadn't felt since November, before trudging back to their own frigid homes with new determination. The coldest night of the winter came on February 8th, when temperatures dropped to 47 below zero at Fort Snelling. The Johnsons' thermometer froze solid. The mercury contracted so far it broke the scale. That night, Thomas Johnson kept his family's fire roaring constantly, burning through half a cord in a single night just to keep interior temperatures above freezing. His children slept in the same bed, fully dressed in every piece of clothing they owned, under every blanket and quilt the family possessed. In the sunken cabin, Ingrid slept comfortably under a single wool blanket. She had built a slightly larger fire before bed, heating her masonry heater's stone mass thoroughly. The interior temperature dropped to 51 degrees by morning, not warm by summer standards, but comfortable enough for sleeping, and vastly better than the 28 degrees the Johnsons endured. When morning came and the impossible cold finally broke, Thomas Johnson made a decision. As soon as spring arrived, he would build an addition to his cabin using Ingrid's principles. He would construct a double-wall section with an air gap, shelter it with earth berms, and see if he could retrofit some of her genius into his exposed hilltop structure. He wasn't alone. Of the 12 homesteading families in the township, 8 made similar plans that brutal winter. The winter of 1868 eventually released its grip on Minnesota, and spring came late, but welcome. As the snow melted and prairie grass began greening, the evidence of winter's toll became visible. The Johnsons had burned through 9.5 cords of wood, more than double their initial estimate. The O'Malleys had actually run short in March and had to burn furniture and fence posts to stay warm. 3 families had temporarily abandoned their claims in February, moving into the township's boarding house until the worst cold passed. Ingrid Halvorsen had burned through 3.25 cords of wood for the entire winter. Her cabin emerged from the snow bank like a revelation, undamaged and dry, while conventional cabins showed winter damage. Cracked logs from freeze-thaw cycling, failed chinking, damaged roofs from snow loads their builders had tried to clear. True to their winter promises, multiple families began modifying their homesteads. Thomas Johnson built a double-walled addition, carefully creating an 18-inch air gap filled partially with prairie grass. The Schmidt family, preparing to build a new barn, decided to partially sink it into a hillside and use the excavated earth to berm the walls, creating earth-sheltered livestock housing. William O'Malley, who had a natural ravine on his land, began planning a second cabin built into the hillside protection. Ingrid became an unlikely consultant, visiting neighboring claims to offer advice on earth sheltering and double-wall construction. She taught them the proper way to layer sod roofs, the importance of drainage channels for below-grade construction, and the principles of building masonry heaters that stored heat rather than sending it up the chimney. Her broken English and Norwegian accent no longer marked her as an outsider. They marked her as an expert with knowledge born from generations of harsh climate survival. The following winter, 1868-69, proved more moderate, but those families who had implemented Ingrid's techniques reported remarkable improvements. Thomas Johnson's modified cabin used 40% less firewood than the previous winter. Schmidt's earth-sheltered barn kept their livestock noticeably warmer and healthier. They lost no animals to cold, while neighbors using conventional barns suffered losses. Word spread beyond the immediate township. An article in a regional newspaper, the Minnesota Pioneer, ran in the fall of 1869 titled, "Norwegian Widow's Earth Home Proves Superior in Brutal Winter." The piece was short and technical, describing the double-wall construction and earth sheltering without flowery language. But farmers across Minnesota and the Dakotas read it with interest. Some experimented with the techniques. Others dismissed it as suitable only for unusual circumstances. Ingrid lived in her sunken cabin for 22 more years, until her death in 1891 at age 67. Her sons eventually returned from Montana and took over her claim. They expanded the original cabin, using the same double wall and earth sheltering principles, creating a larger homestead that remained remarkably comfortable and efficient. Local history records note that the expanded Halvorsen homestead used less firewood than any comparable farm in the county, year after year. The technique spread quietly through Scandinavian and German immigrant communities, populations that had cultural memory of earth-sheltered construction from their homelands. In certain regions, particularly the Dakotas and western Minnesota, earth-sheltered or partially sunken cabins became relatively common among immigrant populations through the 1870s and 1880s. But as lumber became cheaper and architectural styles shifted toward Victorian and pattern book designs, the old techniques fell out of favor. By the early 1900s, earth-sheltered homestead cabins were considered primitive and old-fashioned, something to be replaced as soon as prosperity allowed. The knowledge began to fade. When the generation that had lived through those brutal frontier winters died, much of the practical wisdom died with them. Modern construction, with its reliance on abundant cheap energy for heating, made thermal efficiency less critical. Why build a complicated double-wall structure when you could simply burn more coal or fuel oil? It wasn't until the energy crises of the 1970s that architects and builders began seriously reconsidering earth-sheltered design. Suddenly, techniques that pioneers like Ingrid Halvorsen had employed a century earlier were being discovered as innovative solutions. Books appeared with titles like The Underground House Book and Earth-Sheltered Housing Design, presenting principles that Norwegian and German immigrants had brought to America generations before. The physics hadn't changed: thermal mass, wind protection, earth coupling, dead air space insulation. These worked the same in 1975 as they had in 1867. Modern earth-sheltered homes and buildings now incorporate these century-old principles with contemporary materials and engineering. But the core insights remain. Build with the earth rather than upon it. Use mass to store in moderate temperature, protect from wind, employ air gaps for insulation. Use the Earth's stable temperature as a thermal ally rather than fighting against it. In southeastern Minnesota, not far from where Ingrid Halvorsen built her sunken cabin, a historical marker now stands near the site of the old sinkhole. The original cabin is long gone, but the depression remains, filled in partially over the decades but still visible as a shallow bowl in the prairie. The marker tells the story briefly. Near this site, Norwegian immigrant Ingrid Halvorsen built an earth-sheltered cabin in 1867 that proved superior in thermal efficiency to conventional construction. Her techniques influenced regional building practices and demonstrated traditional earth-building wisdom. The plaque doesn't mention that neighbors laughed at her. It doesn't capture the winter desperation of families freezing in their conventional homes while she sat comfortably below grade. It can't convey the moment when certainty crumbled and respect grew. But perhaps that's fitting. The best validation isn't written in bronze. It's written in the families who stayed warm, the resources conserved, the techniques passed forward, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the old ways, the scorned ways, the unconventional ways, prove themselves not through argument, but through simple, undeniable performance. When winter comes hard and resources run thin, ingenuity matters more than convention. Adaptation matters more than pride. And sometimes the person everyone dismisses, the widow, the immigrant, the one who builds in a hole when everyone else builds on the hill, turns out to be the one who understood the problem most clearly all along. The prairie wind still blows across those Minnesota fields, just as cold and relentless as it was in 1868. But now we understand a little better how to shelter ourselves from its assault, thanks to a Norwegian woman who refused to build where everyone else said was right, and instead built where the physics said it would work. The lesson wasn't just about construction techniques. It was about the wisdom of listening to experience from different places, of being willing to look foolish if the principles are sound, and of understanding that survival sometimes requires building down instead of up, sheltering instead of exposing, protecting instead of enduring. These are lessons that remain relevant whenever we face challenges that conventional wisdom can't solve, whenever the old ways from distant places might hold answers to new problems in unfamiliar lands.